So many of you may know that I work at Fort Mac as part of the redevelopment team as the Arts and Philanthropy Director, and we have some other members here from Fort Mac, but it is my pleasure to introduce Brian Hooker. Brian Hooker serves as the Executive Director of the Fort Mac Land Redevelopment Authority, the organization leading the redevelopment of Fort McPherson, a decommissioned U.S. Army military base located in Atlanta, Georgia. The redevelopment of Fort McPherson will be of regional significance and a catalyst for revitalization of the southwest region of Atlanta. About Brian. Brian is from Southwest Atlanta and studied math and science at Benjamin E. Mays High School and has a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering from Stanford University. Brian worked for the Atlanta Committee for the Olympic Games, then 4 years with IBM. Brian worked nearly a decade in technology and then pursued a real estate career. For over 7 years, Brian learned the ropes of the industry from brokering transactions to negotiating economic incentives for relocating corporations. Brian served as the Director of Real Estate for the Atlanta Beltline, and prior to that, Brian served as the Director of Site Selection Consulting with CBRE. Brian is a certified commercial investment member, a LEED accredited professional, and a graduate of Leadership Atlanta class of 2016. And the Real Estate Associates program, REAP. Today, Brian also serves nationally on both Urban Land Institute's Public Development and Infrastructure Product Council and is co-chair of the Association of Defense Communities LRA Directors Council. Locally, he was appointed to the City of Atlanta's NREM Review Board and serves on the Southwest Atlanta Partnership Board of Directors. Being the Fort Mac LRA Executive Director is not easy, as it requires of Brian to be skilled in developing and communicating a vision, building trust, converting skeptics to believers, inspiring followers, and motivating employees, volunteers, partners, and other stakeholders to take bold action, negotiating big deals, navigating public and private sector needs and resources, implementing projects with a sense of urgency, inspiring through public speaking and media, raising funds for operations and projects, implementing strong governance and financial controls, and establishing and leveraging partnerships. Brian is truly up for the challenge, leading his team, his board, and working with the master developer, Stephen McCauley, and the redevelopment team. Brian lives in South Atlanta with his wife and family. He is a member of the Cascade United Methodist Church, where he serves on the board of trustees. Please give a warm Kiwanis welcome to Brian Hooker.
But thank you all for having me out here. Now, before I get started, how many of you, show of hands, know where Fort Mac is? Wow, okay. How many of you have been to Fort Mac? Wow, that is fantastic. And how many of you have been since Fort Mac closed? Smaller handful. Okay, so for those of you who don't know where Fort Mac is, and that's, of course, Fort McPherson, named from General James Birdseye McPherson, is colloquially known as Fort Mac. What I want to do is point out where it is. So you can see Atlanta, the great I-285, and then that green inner circle is the Atlanta Beltline. So southwest of the Atlanta Beltline, about a mile down the road, is the Fort Mac property. It's about 500 acres of land, 486 acres of land, that opened in 1885 and was basically a federal reservation for years and years. You also see on this screen a red dotted line. That red dotted line is the Aerotropolis area. So Fort Mac is near the northern end of the Aerotropolis. Everybody familiar with the Aerotropolis? No? Okay. We got a few no's. So Aerotropolis stands for Airport City, and it's a major initiative to redevelop the areas that are around Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. So we will definitely want to make sure you get plugged in and more of that. Probably have a speaker on Aerotropolis. You would be very interested to hear my colleague Shannon James, what he's doing down there. Let's zoom in a little closer, and you can see that Fort Mac is also right along the MARTA line. There's a MARTA station called Lakewood Fort McPherson. right next to the property. And then about a mile north of that is the Oakland City MARTA station, which is just steps from the northern border of the property. And then that red dot line there actually is running along Campbellton Road. Campbellton Road is one of the most heavily trafficked public transportation bus routes in all of MARTA. And so a BRT, bus rapid transit, or light rail line is planned down Campbellton Road, and there will be a stop also in the Fort Mac property redevelopment. So you literally will have, you've got a property that will touch 3 transit stops, 2 today and 1 in the future, that makes this a wonderful transit-oriented development opportunity. This has been going on for quite some time. I mentioned that Fort Mac opened in 1885. Its closure was announced in 2005. And what I lead, the Fort Mac Local Redevelopment Authority, was created in its current form and present form in 2006 to say, okay, well, what are we going to do with this property? The Army is going to move away, and the Army is going to sell it to us. Now, the Army wanted a lot of money for it. They didn't sell it for $1 like they'd done in previous BRAC rounds, so that became part of the question. How are we going to finance the acquisition of the property? So you go through several iterations until you get to 2011 when the property actually closed. You fast forward to 2015, and that was when we were able to buy the property from the Army. Now, some of you may know that for this 486 acres, the Army had already sold 11 of those acres, 10 to Department of Veterans Affairs, which has a clinic at the property that's operating and doing great, and then 1 acre, half acre each went to the 2 credit unions that were existing there. So the Army says, we've got 475 acres in one hand, and we want $30 million in this other hand in order for you to get the 475 acres. And the way we facilitated that transaction was with the help of the private sector. Remember, this is about public-private partnerships. And all of you have heard what private sector individual and company bought Fort Mac, and that is?
Tyler Perry.
Tyler Perry, that's right. So Tyler Perry Studios paid for the entire property, paid the entire $30 million, and for that, received 330 of the 475 acres. Paid $30 million, got 330 acres. And what does that do? That left 145 acres in the hands of the Fort Mac LRA to lead the redevelopment of that property in a manner that will uplift the surrounding community. Well, why is that important? If you look at a picture of a film studio, the definition in the dictionary, you see a 9-foot-tall wall. That's a very important part of their business model. Privacy, protecting their A-listers, protecting the confidentiality of the things that they're working on. And Fort Mac was already surrounded by a wall that the local community hated. Because that wall, that separation, hadn't always been there. As it was placed there over the years, it meant that the impact of the nearly 7,000 military and civilian workers there just was lessened. And you saw a tremendous downturn in the community. So they wanted the wall to come down. So that's why the property that the LRA kept is such a funny shape. If you look over on the screen, you see that there's a green space in the middle that's surrounded by a yellow line that's a little difficult to see. All that green space from the Grand Parade Ground, the big green field in the upper right corner, all the way down through the center, you can see what obviously was a golf course. That is what has become Tyler Perry Studios. The black outline around the brightly colored areas are the 145 acres that remains with us. And so on the left side of the picture, that borders Campbellton Road, and on the right side of the picture, you've got that Lee Street MARTA corridor running along there. So you've got this kind of funny boomerang shape of a property that surrounds Tyler Perry Studios. But what does it really do? It gives us the opportunity to reconnect the property as best we can with the surrounding community. As the walls come down, as redevelopment takes place, you'll get much better engagement with the surrounding community. So, out of the deal, the Local Redevelopment Authority gets 145 acres. And a little bit of cash. We actually got the Army to accept $26 million instead of $30 million. So we walk away from the closing table with $4 million and 145 acres. Well, now what? For years, planning had been taking place to say this was going to be a life sciences research park. What are we going to do? We look back at the history and say, well, Fort McPherson has a wonderful, rich history of the Forces Command, the Pentagon of the South, and the great things that the Army did there over many years. But today, when you look at it, you see the upper picture, that's what it looks like. That's the wall that I was talking about. You've got this, GDOT freeway separator wall looking thing on top of a rusted out retaining wall below it along Lee Street, which on the other side of the street is the rail line and the MARTA line. You're in this industrial hole right there. And people don't even think that there's something going on the other side of that fence. But the lower half of the picture is a picture of inside Fort Mac. This is what it looks like today. There's not a lot of activity, but there's beautiful rolling lawns of green space and some buildings scattered in there. So every now and then we have events and we invite people out so they can see what's going on inside as we gear up to move forward with the plan. You all may have heard about a life sciences research park that was planned there years before the Tyler Perry Studios acquisition. Well, that was a great idea. It would have been nice to try to pull that off at Fort McPherson. But the market sees Southwest Atlanta a little differently than the optimists do. They see demographics with median household incomes of $26,000 or $25,000 a household. That's pretty low. They see the homes in disrepair, many vacant and boarded up. They see very poor quality retail and poor performing schools. So when the development community, when the market says, you want us to come and invest a couple $100 million, nearly $1 billion in this area, no thank you, not yet. We don't see how we're going to be able to make the rents in order to justify this type of investment. Well, that's been going on for quite some time. In the development community, we've heard many, many years, you don't invest south of I-20. Don't invest south of I-20. That's almost a mantra in Atlanta's real estate community that's only beginning in very few recent years to see some redirection. But that's not new. On the illustration here, the Homeowners Loan Corporation Residential Security Map of Atlanta is an actual thing that the federal government did that said, don't issue loans in these areas. So down on the bottom of the screen, many of you may not be able to see it where it says Fort Mac, there's an arrow pointing to Fort Mac. And you can see that many of the areas surrounding Fort Mac are in the yellow, which is just one grade above red. This is literally where the term redlining came from. So in all of these communities, government officials used logic, proximity to Negro property, infiltration of lower income groups, too many renters, not enough owners, affected the security rating, which meant you couldn't get one of those great new post-World War II government-backed loans. And so, a lot of people think migration patterns were all voluntary, but when you put that huge financial incentive behind it, where even developers who wanted to build mixed-race communities were told, you can't do that if you want your residents to be able to get these loans. There was a policy that drove this separation. So when we are looking at Fort Mac, it's not just a piece of property that happens to be in Southwest Atlanta that we want to bring some new development for. We've got to look at the bigger picture. What is it that we're solving for? Why won't the market come down here? And what can we do to change that? So that's where a very important driver behind what we're doing. Here's another one, and I hate throwing up all these stats, but I want you to see something. How many of you have heard this projection before that the city of Atlanta is going to have 1.3 million people in 2050? Okay, not a few of them. Well, where does that projection come from? It comes from these surveys that say, the National Real Estate Organization surveys that say, if you ask people where they prefer to live in a walkable community, 39% of them say that's where they prefer to live. And you ask people where would they prefer to live in a city with a mix of uses, about 15% of surveyed people say that's where I'd like to live. That means 85% don't, so we don't want to get confused. But 15% of the people would like to live in a city with a mix of uses. So the idea is, well, we're projecting the future population of Metro Atlanta at 3.5 million people. 15% of that is 1.3 million people. That's what the population of the city of Atlanta could be. A couple of holes in that logic. One of them is, if you look at what I've highlighted, if 15% of people lived in Atlanta today, the city of Atlanta would have a population of 900,000. Anybody know what the actual city of Atlanta population is?
It's about half.
Yes, 500,000. So there are 400,000 people who by survey would like to live within the city of Atlanta, but choose not to. Can you imagine who those people are? The wealthy live where they want to live. People, high net worth individuals, high income folks, they've got choice. The poor aren't very mobile. So they tend not to just move around as freely as some other folks. The folks who would like to live here are working class people, people in the middle class, who, if in Atlanta, the way we are set up, if there's a place where you might be able to afford to live, it's a place, a community like Southwest Atlanta, where there are few services and poor performing public schools. So you could afford to live there, but now you can't afford, now you gotta put your kids in private school. That doesn't work very well. So I want you to keep in mind that workforce housing is a major problem that we're solving for. So we talked about the history, the market, and the need for workforce housing. This is something that applies to all of Atlanta. So I'm not going to belabor this, but I want you to look at a 2-bedroom apartment on here. This is a recent affordable housing deal that came out of Invest Atlanta that says someone's going to build new apartments. And for people a family of 3 who makes less than $54,000 a year, they can rent this 3-bedroom apartment for $1,347 a month. That's a pretty good deal. But is that really realistic for working class? I mean, working class people, you got 2 folks making $30,000 a year, they make too much. And so now you move to the market rate, so now they make $60,000 a year, but if they want to be in that same building, they've got to pay $3,100 a month in rent. It's not happening. There's a middle that's missing, focused on the workforce, and that's a huge part of what we're trying to do at Fort Mac. Here you have the results of our community surveying that said quality affordable housing was the main thing they wanted to see, as well as all these other areas. And so we were able to move forward on top of our new planning process and join with Macaulay Investments to create a public-private partnership that will lead to the revitalization of Fort McPherson. I'll show you what the plan is for that redevelopment. First, you have the Western District. It contains a school, likely going to be a high-performing public school or public charter, surrounded by workforce housing, where we're building with intentionality housing product that can meet that middle that has been missing for quite some time. Here's some other views of the school. One of the things that became very important, we wanted to make sure people could see what the vision is of what's coming to Fort Mac so that we could have the community give input, understand what's going on, and then join with us as we seek to make this thing happen. We move over to our next district along Campbellton Road, mostly housing, but there's the picture there in the lower right is a restaurant that would come in across the street from the Fort Mac property, and it shows also the streetcar along Campbellton Road. Here are a few more views in that area, and there's something that's mentioned in this slide, the Fort Mac JAC, the Job and Career Center, another very important component. If you want to uplift people in the community, we wanted to bring a resource to them that could help folks get trained, get jobs, go from 0 to 10 or 12 bucks an hour, and then take the next step into a program that could really get them a reasonable income. Because that's a battle you have to fight, as well as for seniors on a fixed income, you do need to be able to deliver some senior housing. But the designs here are all, this is a small commercial node that is designed to house small businesses and that Job and Career Center. Then we get to our Heritage District, where we've got a bunch of historic properties within the Fort Mac footprint, and many of those must be preserved, and we're also going to be able to put some infill buildings in there. So here, we're focused on some new housing in the upper right that mimics the character of the older homes, and then in the lower right, you've got one of the new developments that's going to come out of the ground first, a mixed income multifamily development that steps away from the Oakland City MARTA station. So we're very excited that that's about to go, and that new development is going to be blended in with the older development in that Heritage District. And finally, the biggest piece of development is the Market District. And here we've got an aerial illustration of the municipal market that we'll put in. We've got to lead with the municipal market, something like the Sweet Auburn Market, so that the housing units will come in. The developers want to build multifamily, but they want there to be something for their tenants to shop at. So you always have that chicken and egg, retail first or housing first. Well, real estate community knows retail follows rooftops. It's not going in first unless you subsidize the heck out of it. So we're not going to be able to get a broad range of retail, but by starting off with the Sweet Auburn type municipal market, the Fort Mac municipal market, we'll be able to create some energy and momentum that will immediately lead to about 1,000 units of housing being developed there. And then from there, the cycle continues on. One of the heart of that development is the Fort Mac Mile. So on the previous slide, there was an aerial view of this. On the lower right, you've got this street, bike trail, and multi-use walking trail that would allow people at the Fort Mac property to move throughout the Fort Mac property, but also will have a trail network that connects it up to the Atlanta Beltline. So that's a very important part of this. In fact, the more we've studied this trail, the more we've realized that trail-oriented development is a term that we're going to be using as we market this opportunity. A very pedestrian-friendly development, both on and off the trail, where there will be lots of areas where pedestrians can congregate without vehicles interfering with them, and public art is a big part of what we're doing as well. This is a public-private partnerships, and we need partners. So everyone from the City of Atlanta to the Office of Economic Adjustment within the DoD that funds our operations up through this year, to the Aerotropolis Atlanta, you see many, many partners on this. But in the lower right, you'll notice we don't have the corporate and philanthropic partners at the table yet. And so that's something that we are working on, and I'm hoping that some of you might even be able to help us with. We also need to have funding for this P3 to work, and we are in a qualified opportunity zone. You can see in the center bottom of the picture, roughly that red outline, it's Fort Mac with a little bit extra on it. It's in one of those opportunity zone areas. Now, the federal qualified opportunity zone is a relatively new program. It came from the tax law that was passed last year, but it allows for some tremendous benefits. So that is going to allow people, it's really going to attract a lot of investment, and we'd love to talk to you in more detail about that. This project could break ground in 2019. We're almost ready, but there's one problem. We're in the Campbellton Road Tax Allocation District, but that tax allocation district is not complete as a source of funding because the school system doesn't participate in it. I've been telling people recently, one vote by Atlanta Public Schools to come into the Campbellton Road tab would mean the Fort Mac redevelopment would break ground in 2019. But that's a big lift. There's so many politics going on there between the city and the school board that we are looking for alternate ways to get the $30 million we need for phase one to launch this development. So we are excited. We've got a plan that our community loves, a plan that addresses the real needs of mixed income opportunity, mixed income retail, workforce housing, and we're on the verge of being able to make it happen. My contact information, I'd love to hear from you if you have any more questions, you'd like a link to this presentation, even if you'd like a link to our entire 251-page master plan. To share that with you. So thank you all for having me today.